This is lecture 6 in the Western intellectual tradition. I want to reflect briefly on Jean-Jacques Rousseau, do a couple of reflections on Rousseau. Our readings will be looking at his argument in terms of the origins of inequality and the role of property within that. Obviously a very different understanding of property, and he or she has it, and then the inequality that flows from that. Rousseau's arguments in his discourses on inequality had a significant impact on Karl Marx's understanding of property, and particularly the bourgeois and the proletariat. In that sense, Marx draws significantly from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Rousseau's thinking, some would argue that it led to the French Revolution, in particular the immense inequality of the aristocrats who had the property, and then middle and particularly lower class who lacked it, and hence the revolution and the rebellion to overcome that inequality in the name of equality. And so Rousseau's thinking played a significant role, whether it was interpreted properly at night, both within the French Revolution and Marx's thinking. So there's a direct line and lineage in elements of Rousseau as interpreted in a certain way that leads right into the French Revolution and then Marx and Russian Revolution itself. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, very, very important thinker. The other thing with Rousseau is there are some who seek to dismiss Rousseau as a thinker because at times his rather indulgent lifestyle, a bit of a fop and a cad at times, his own treatment or lack of treatment of his own children in a meaningful way, essentially allowing them to become orphans, his relationship with women. And so to what degree, when studying any philosopher, some would even claim that Jean-Jacques Rousseau was not a philosopher in any significant sense of the word. He was more of a poet and a literary person who, in an adequate and limited way, attempted to deal with larger social, political, economic questions. That's one way of dismissing him, by dismissing him in terms of his lifestyle. The same thing has often been done to Friedrich Nietzsche. Well, the man went mad, so why would you take his ideas seriously? Or Martin Heidegger, because of his flirting with National Socialism, why would one study his philosophy? That approach really is inappropriate and not very helpful in understanding the insights of Rousseau and what he has to offer in terms of not only his work on the origins of inequality and the emergence of property and possessions, and then how that leads to inequality, but also his work on the social contract and the general will. I want to briefly reflect on two terms Rousseau uses. They both mean self-love. One is Amour de soi and the other is Amour propre, and in French. And as I said, they both mean self-love. Rousseau is very interested in the self. What is the self? And of course, classical Greek thought, know yourself. Jesus, love your neighbor as yourself. So what is the self? Psychology has looked at the self in terms of the unconscious, the subconscious, the conscious. The self can have many desires that collide on the ship of their being. So what is this self versus its counterfeit? What is the difference between the self and its enculturated, it's socialized? For we are, as Heidegger said, beings of thrownness. We're thrown into a body, we're thrown into a language, we're thrown into a time, we're thrown into a context none of us ask for. What if we were thrown into a different body, a different color of skin, a different context? Who would we be then, or our understanding of ourselves at that point? Now, in Jean-Jacques Rousseau, there's, I think, a superficial way of reading Rousseau, and then there's a more substantive way of reading Rousseau. The more superficial way of reading Rousseau, given these two understandings of love, is that Rousseau pits the state of nature against the state of society. So the state of society, or the Amour, Propre, or the proper way, is the self as we come to understand ourselves through other people's feedback, the reinforcement we get, the way we come to understand our sense of our being through upbringing, with families, with peers, communities. And where we get positive feedback, we tend to see ourselves as that. It's reinforced through others' feedback. That's often the socializing process, which is a way of the conventional self. It's what society does to shape us, to mold us, for the times we live in, through education, through work, through religious communities. And so for Rousseau, this social forming, this inculturation, distorts who we are at a deeper level. Now, he will argue the deeper self-love, before we are socialized, is the role of being in touch with our nature and nature itself. Rousseau has a particular interpretation of the history of humankind as they emerge from a state of nature into a state of society. But he will suggest that, in fact, to the degree people are not socialized by society through education, through culture, through civilization, in fact, there is a deeper level of their being that they lose in the process of being domesticated by society through education, through work, through fitting in economically, through having their possessions, their properties. And for Rousseau, it's, if you really love yourself, first the question is, each person has to break through that socialized, enculturated self, which we think is ourself, to get to a more essential self, which is isolated in one sense from society. And this is what he calls amour de soi, love of that self. And so there is this contrast in Rousseau. And so his book, for example, Amour, is an attempt to do education away from the formal educational process that takes place via the state, in which people are socialized to think a certain way, to see certain ethics in a certain way, to come to see how their life journey is to unfold based on society's, parents, friends' expectations. But in the process, they lose who they really are at a deeper level, and they reach a point in their life where restlessness sets in, because the role they are playing on the stage of life, in fact, is not them. And when the play is over for the day, or the work environment, or the friendships, there's these deeper elements that remain restless, unsatisfied. And it is to those elements Rousseau, in his alternate approach to education with the meal, pointed. Now, in Rousseau's Confessions, for example, there are many elements of the self as well to explore. And so the rawness at times, the dark elements, the undealt with issues in the sub or the unconscious that are always there. Rousseau's Confessions are very different, for example, than Tolstoy's Confessions, or Cardinal Newman's Apologia Pro Vita Sua, or St. Augustine's Confessions. In exploring the self, the question is, what is the self of these many desires, these many longings? Some are crude desires that lead to a sense of unfulfillment, of betrayal. They lead to dead ends at the end of the day. There are bourgeois desires in which people only long for personal peace and security and possessions and property, and sort of the economic being drives them. But is there more to those particular drives? And as people ceased to play a role they've conditioned to play, what else is there to them, or is there anything else to them? And so in Rousseau, the one danger is to see Rousseau purely as the state of nature is a good, and to the degree we become socialized or enculturated, we lose our true being. And so the task of education is to get people back to their primordial, their basic being, which is their nature in that sense. And so the one of nature is idealized, and the role of socialization is denigrated in this approach to Rousseau. Now, is there more to Rousseau than that? And in his social contract and general will, is he more complicated? And the element of Rousseau is he obviously is more complicated. And Rousseau lives with tensions which people find frustrating in Rousseau, and they want to say, this is what Rousseau thought, this is what he did think. Rousseau lives with trying tensions in his thinking, which makes him a little more difficult and complicated to get at in his thinking, in particular his notion of self-love and the tensions he's living with there. So when we think of nature, or Amour, or getting back to the primordial or essential being that has been socialized, what is the truth of what is being said there by Rousseau and the good that we may lose in socialization, but what is the dark side of turning to nature itself in terms of human nature or humans' relationship to nature itself? Is that some pure Edenic state, some Shangri-La of being, if people just turn to their human nature at the deepest level, or the relationship to the natural world? Is that the answer to the socialization process in which people lose their sense of who they are? So Rousseau grapples with human nature itself and its complex nature. It's not as simple as if we just get back to nature versus society or culture or education, then we will have found our true being, because in fact, the more one turns to that, they realize that's complex as well. And in the level of Amour Propre, or being socialized, what is the downside of the socialization process in terms of losing one's sense at a deeper level of who one might be, and genuine desires to live at a more meaningful level from deeper places? But what is the role of society also in shaping people to a better understanding of themselves? There's the negative side, but there's also the positive. And so in his work in the social contract, for example, and the general will, what Rousseau is doing is he's trying to look at the relationship of the individual and society, and how society and the general will can often be right in a way in which the individual has to find who they are within that particular context. And so his whole social contract is an attempt to argue the role of socialization in a meaningful sense, so the individual can find their most meaningful fulfillment within the context of that. So there are these tensions in Rousseau, as I mentioned earlier, very dangerous merely to see him as the get back to nature literally, or human nature versus socialization, which is the problem. Within Rousseau, there is the tensions within human nature as one moves away from socialization and culturation for what is human nature. And does Rousseau's notion of self-love, either in one or its other form, amour de soi or amour propre, truly and deeply go to the roots of human nature itself and the relationship of human nature and nature? This is a question that needs to be probed a little further and a little deeper in terms of the appeal of Rousseau as a thinker, but perhaps his blind spots. Interesting enough, George Grant, who will be finishing this course with, he argued in one of his articles near the end of his life that the three most prominent thinkers that have articulated modernity in its most challenging way are Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Martin Heidegger. And he thought Rousseau needed to be studied much more. Particularly, he argues in Rousseau, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, the old classical notion of teleology, that all things have their proper end. To the degree we understand nature in that classical sense. With Rousseau, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, they're what we call historicist. We essentially are beings of history. There is no teleology, there is no end, there is no definite right or wrong. All is simply contract. And to that degree, humans make up their reality. For there is no reality other than what we make up. And through contracts, we work together, individuals and communities, in trying to find some tentative, imperfect good with really no serious markings anymore, other than the individual and community imperfectly finding their way through time, with all the historic cairns and maps essentially gone. And so Rousseau, Grant will argue, along with Nietzsche and Heidegger, are three of the figures when we think modern philosophy, both philosophical in their thinking, but using literature and the arts as well to articulate this as key thinkers. As mentioned earlier, Rousseau does point to Karl Marx. Marx obviously grappling with the economic issues in a far more profound way following Hegel than Rousseau was, but certainly Rousseau's critique of property and how it leads to inequality is very different from John Locke. And Locke and Hobbes, in their understandings of the state of nature, is very different from Rousseau's as well. And so when we think of Rousseau, Locke, and Hobbes, their understanding of the state of nature, Rousseau is much more positive, but also aware of the limitations of the state of nature. But his arguments for inequality dealing with property and possession very much isolates or separates him more or less from Locke and Hobbes, and points the way certainly to the French Revolution, to Marx, and to the Russian Revolution, and other forms of leftist thinking. And so Rousseau, very, very important to grapple with, and Rousseau does point to key thinkers, English thinkers like Locke and Hobbes, just as Marx is going to draw from Adam Smith, arguing these are key thinkers, but they also come to question them in serious ways. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, self-love. What does he mean by self-love? What is the self? And Rousseau really explores that layered and complex nature of the self and the mystery of the self, and the question, of course, to ask of Rousseau in his understanding of self-love: what is the self that is meant to be loved, and are there greater depths to the self that Rousseau himself has never probed in a substantive or serious way?